There's this very specific type of PlayStation exclusive that has permeated through PlayStation Studios over the last decade and a half. The Last of Usificiation of its catalogue has seen the aforementioned zombie game, but also God of War, Horizon, and many others take on a very noticeable narrative style. More personal and emotive, slightly slower gameplay, filled with sections where you walk through dilapidated areas and you are regaled of the world around you. People often go back and forth on whether or not this has had a positive effect on PlayStation, but it certainly had an effect. Days Gone, when it launched in 2019, didn't just represent part of what this style was going for, but how the backlash around it shapes people's perception of the things sitting right in front of them. I know this, as I was affected by my own misconceptions too. Often unfairly maligned as an attempt at a Last of Us, a macho game unserved by its grander narrative, and a title that tries to be way flashier than it is, Days Gone is somehow very different to the game I remembered it being, and a little stuck in trying to be too many things at once. Despite this, it can be oddly brave too, directly criticising many of the aesthetics and themes it relies on. Many of its inhabitants are deeply aware of the world before it all, and willing to bring up politics and philosophy. It's one of the least polished PlayStation exclusives I've played in, well, ever, but I enjoyed its messiness way more than I thought I would. Here is what I learned when I revisited Days Gone. I try olives maybe once or twice a month, and I have for some time now. I consider myself an open-minded person, yet something about its texture, taste and smell has always put me off. I don't have as visceral a reaction as I have to the distinctive pop of a ripe tomato, but I've never been able to convince myself to like them. I have this relationship to games too, which probably explains why I like bashing my head off the lumbering wall that is the entire Souls-like genre. I like acquiring a particular taste, yet oddly enough this is exactly what I disliked about Days Gone when I first played it years ago. It didn't challenge my taste buds. Its texture was homogeneous and soft. It disappeared on my tongue like candy floss, yet didn't leave that sweet aftertaste. It felt hollow. I just finished my degree and spotted a killer deal at a local store where you could trade in a PS4 for a PS4 Pro and an extra game if you bring in a few select titles. This is obviously designed to devalue the price of those games you've already bought and maximise the amount you can get off the second-hand market, but I was a savvy shopper and managed to get that upgrade and new games for less than 30. I knew the reputation this game had. It had launched in a buggy state, sitting in the 60s and 70s on review aggregate sites. I thought I could acquire the taste, and yet what I saw was a mismatch, a pastiche of everything else around it. The world at large had already started to reach diminishing returns with Ubisoft's open world formula, and Days Gone's slow unfurling of its own felt less like an intentional crawlback of a scary map, and more a hand reaching out to make sure you don't get lost crossing the proverbial road to the next batch of zombies to take down. Now, 35 hours of gameplay later, I don't necessarily think my first impressions were wrong, but they were nuanced and didn't capture the full picture. I've already mentioned The Last of Us too many times to feel fully comfortable in my comparison. I think sometimes games can be misserved by them. They do often help, of course, not only to give you the language to compare worlds and articulate what is done right, but also to prime you in one of the many ways one can look at that world. A comparison could be a palate cleanser, giving you something to latch onto and move from, but it can also be overwhelming too, overriding your ability to see what is actually going on. For that reason, we're mostly dropping the comparison to The Last of Us here. It is important to keep the game in mind, of course, not because it's similar, which it isn't really any deeper than a very shallow level, but because that was part of the conversation at the time. It primed people for a game that didn't deliver. With what is admittedly an excessive amount of preamble, let's actually get into the game. In Days Gone, you play Deacon St. John, a biker caught up in the zombie apocalypse whose pre-apocalypse behavioural patterns of distrust and confidence with weapons led him to outlast many of the souls around him. You are greeted with a very short introduction of the first day, where he and his pal Boozer leave his wife Sarah to get out of an infected city on a government-controlled helicopter, as there's not enough room for everyone. Then, years later, not much is left other than the two, and a headstone dedicated to Sarah at a helicopter crash. As the name Days Gone implies, this is a game largely driven by grief and the things we do to keep ourselves moving when the world around us seems to stop. There's this funny parallel to real-life grief that is interwoven throughout every inch of the game. When someone close to you dies now, one of the most jarring things about life is watching everything else but you continue on anyway. If you get on a train, not one person knows or even cares what's going on in your life. The world around Deacon has almost come to a crawl, with freaks, the game's zombies, acting like particularly dangerous local fauna. He moves because he must, even if that comes to the end of another man's life. Well, that's until you get control of him. I remember Days Gone being heavily criticised on its launch for its tone. The dead wife opening was seen as contrived, especially when paired with the rough biker culture at its core, and certain scenes were cherry-picked, like a throwaway line from the partner at their wedding asking Deacon to promise to quote-unquote ride her like he rides his bike. I do think a degree of this criticism is fair, and I'll get into that later, but first, some quick spoilers on that scene. Yeah, that line is ironic. Sarah, our female lead, criticises bikers who say that at their wedding, and then she says it to Deacon. It's a turn of phrase that is supposed to be alarming and charming, and it sort of is. It's still a little cringy, but not as much as I otherwise thought. The game's story is constantly interrupted with these moments, sections where you see your wife pre-apocalypse and get some connective strands to explain Deacon, Boozer, and the party that surrounds them. That phrase, days gone, is an important one that primes you on the game. Days gone isn't about surviving. It's about thriving. 700 days have passed, you're still alive. Now what? Days Gone's gameplay is slow. You are punished for taking on too many enemies at once, and this makes perhaps one of its biggest marketing stunts, the horde mechanic, genuinely rather terrifying. This took up a substantial amount of the adverts at the time and feels a little misplaced in the final game. It is a crucial part of the world, but not the driving factor. It was almost treated like a tech demo of the power of the PS4 and not the power of the game itself. In the first 10 or so hours, I found myself afraid to overextend past the camp you start in, for fear of running out of gas and getting moved down by the nearest gaggle of fauna, we'll say. As part of this, your bike is your single beam of darkness in the light and your loyal steed. As you upgrade it, you can pick up ammo to fire at a few more enemies, you can use it to save your game, and you can ride it out of harm's way. It becomes almost a character in itself, like Roach from The Witcher, except you can't whistle it to your location, however great that may be. Guns and ammo are relatively limited, with even the max capacity not lasting that long, and you go down in just a few swings. However, it's not a survival horror game. Supplies are plentiful if you know where to look, and you can only carry very few resources, so you're incentivized to burn through what little you have as you go. This is a middling mechanic that often inorganically pauses gameplay. For instance, you need Molotov cocktails to burn down freaker nests, but if you don't have the resources for it and end up stranded without them, you have to start missions elsewhere and hope you get enough to clear the rest of them out. Though it's a decent limiting system early on to avoid overstepping and clearing an entire area, it feels like a noticeable stopgap within just a few hours. Another thing that takes this out of survival horror territory and closer to a straight-up action game is its approach to levels in its world. You get XP from killing enemies and doing missions, which can then be sunk into a handful of minor skill trees for a longer attack combo or better looting or better agility. These aren't so revolutionary that I long for the next upgrade to complete a build, but also not so little that I don't notice. It's a serviceable level-up system but lacks any real originality. It doesn't do anything you haven't seen elsewhere. Of course, you can have survival horror games that have XP systems and level ups, but the specific skills you earn and how that makes you approach the world is very action oriented. Speaking of the world, at its worst it can feel like the lowest moments of the Ubisoft formula, with nonsense camps to clear out and a litany of collectibles. Some of these collectibles, like those found in Neuropsites, the mysterious governmental entity studying the virus, are generally pretty good, offering insight into the world and a small story of how the site you found yourself in has become overrun. Others, like viewpoints, tourist memorabilia, and some scraps of paper, just feel like busy work to keep you chugging away at that platinum. This brings me to perhaps one of the worst parts of the Days Gone experience. Many of the game's central important missions are locked behind nonsense busy work like clearing out hostile camps or rescuing hostages. As side quests, this is not good, but wouldn't otherwise detract from the more mainline experience. As part of the main quest, this not only brings an inorganic halt to the story, but prolongs the game a good 10 or so hours past the point it probably should have concluded. Deacon's story, ironically, starts to run out of gas. Days Gone has noticeable flaws, yet I think it's quite good in other ways. I think to give a good idea of the surprise I felt revisiting, I'm going to talk a little about my perception of the game beforehand. I've seen and been told multiple times since its launch that critics were very harsh on Days Gone. If you look at aggregator websites, which I have problems with but we don't exactly have time to unearth here, it's firmly at 71. Not only is this a respectable score, but even more understandable given the game failed to function for some people on launch. This was one of the buggiest first-party titles in a long time, and it shows. It is still very buggy now. A majority of PlayStation's catalogue is made up of tightly designed experiences where you are walked through a strict narrative and brought through to the end, a healthy scoop of spectacle alongside it. There are games designed to stick themselves in your brain for longer than you play, and, for the most part, they succeed. Days Gone absolutely has these moments when you aren't caught in the middle of whatever else it wants to throw at you. However, its public image has not been helped by its director John Garvin. Known for his work on Siphon Filter, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and of course Days Gone, he has swung wildly in different directions for why he thought Days Gone had failed. In a conversation with David Jaffe, a game director of the original God of War and, we'll say, pot stirrer, for lack of a better word, he blamed the lack of a Days Gone sequel on gamers failing to buy it at its full price. Sony did consider the game a failure for many reasons. His rationale is particularly strange. First, the game launched in an awful state, as mentioned previously. Second, as Jaff points out, how do you know if you love a game if you haven't tried it? The rising cost of video games, cost of living crisis, and a huge array of titles launching every day, this feels quite tone deaf on his behalf. Jaff says something here that links into another particularly strange thing Garvin would go on to say. Wishing for a Cinderella story, Jaff imagines Days Gone receiving a revival, with consumers picking it up en masse, comparing it to the physical release of Austin Powers. He says, what if consumers could ignore the quote-unquote annoying Metacritic and the quote-unquote annoying messaging from certain critics? I think this hostility touches on a combative attitude between critics and the creators, one that, in this case, feels rather one-sided on Garvin's behalf. See, you can't have Days Gone 2 because of woke. I'm being hyperbolic, but not as much as you'd think. Later, he would go on to blame Days Gone's poor reception on tech issues, reviewers who apparently didn't actually play the game. I have no clue where this comes from and found no evidence of his claim. And thirdly, of course, woke reviewers. He claimed they couldn't handle a gruff white biker looking at his date's ass. I am so sorry, but we have to do it. Let's talk about the politics of Days Gone. We've talked about priming so far in this, and that's because I wrote the script ahead of time and know what foreshadowing is, but also because the game is both a victim of and perpetrator of this. The tough veneer of a biker is part of pop culture and often comes with it some nasty tropes. It would be fair to call Deacon politically homeless, not in the I'm going to agree with every right-wing talking point but I have a kind of hippie aesthetic way, but like genuinely with some degree of honesty and introspection. You meet Mark Copeland very early on, one of the central leader of the game's handful of camps. As the game is set in Oregon, his camp is just outside of traditional city life, with trees scattered around. A prepper, conspiracy theorist, and libertarian, he hates big government and almost savours the fact that his prepperism has, in some way, led him to being alive now. He is practically salivating at the mouth for the destruction that hit the world years prior and seems almost glad for the zombie apocalypse. Though he seems to kind of hate him, Deacon doesn't fully disagree with him though. When Copeland name drops the lies that perpetuated the Iraq War and firmly argues in favour of personal freedoms, Deacon isn't directly critical of this line of thinking, though he does think Copeland is a bit of a hypocrite. Deacon isn't a prepper, but he is prepped, and he seems to dislike Copeland for it. Ada Tucker, the leader of the Hot Springs camp, is an authoritarian who takes in practical slaves and forces them to work for their food. Interestingly, each camp offers you degrees of both cash and trust for sending survivors, yet Ada offers you the most cash and no trust. She runs a business and mostly sits in a single spot while others work. While Deacon is implied to have sent workers to this camp before now, and you can send them if you choose to in the game, he finds himself pushing back as you take control. He is deeply cynical and critical of this camp too. See, I think this is where his character got lost in translation somewhat. Cynicism isn't a character builder or a facade, it's a survival tactic. That is to say, it kind of is a facade, but not in the way you would think. He's been through years of bruises, cuts and stabs, and life before the apocalypse required him only relying on a handful of others. He's flawed and damaged in a way that is downright understandable. However, the game isn't consistent in the way it tells these stories. When you find out a scientist named O'Brien knew of Deacon's wife's disappearance and knew that Nero didn't take her on his plane, he gets angry at O'Brien for trying to empathise with him, yet thanks him anyway. This is a moment of clarity and maturity on his behalf, the ability to let go. Then, when the cutscene is over, he's immediately shouting at another problem in his mind. There's this tension sometimes between a character who wants to be better and the narrative that needs him not to be. Days Gone could be brave and lock you out of relationships and paths forever, touching on the desolation that one's decisions brings, but it doesn't. It needs to be a video game. It thoroughly spotlights masculinity and most importantly the toxic elements of it as Buta comes down with an infection from the attack and refuses help, yet his own toxic elements aren't always challenged in the process. In a flashback scene, Deacon's wife talks about the lack of people of colour in his life and his biking gang, yet this is rarely revisited. These are set-dressing moments that add texture to the more uncomfortable parts of the world that I wish the narrative delved into a bit more. It could cut away some of the chaff that comes with extra side quests and fetch quests, to give something deeper and more grounded, but it never quite commits to it. There are plenty of moments in Days Gone itself that I'm surprised a man like Garvin wouldn't call woke. Deacon can get a bleeding heart at points, and Iron Mike, the most likeable camp leader, is a pacifist through and through. Witnessing the horrors of the world, he clashes constantly with Deacon because he believes humans are much better than Deacon sees them. Iron Mike is a boomer and has lived through the horrors of his own actions, but he's an egalitarian at heart. He wants to give people a fair trial for their crimes and wants fundamentally the best for everyone. The game can treat him as somewhat naive for this, but he's also treated with reverence. No camp is above criticism, but his is very clearly the best. See, the cynicism returns, but it feels different now. The story of Days Gone itself is mostly narratively satisfying, but a little textbook. It takes the principles of Chekhov's gun, that is to say an element that is introduced and then paid off later, and mostly sticks to it with a neat bow. It's a clean story where 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 + 2 = 4. You are left often not searching around for a greater meaning or grounded mysteries, as they are laid out and explained thoroughly. This is why a pretty schlocky cliffhanger ending feels unsatisfying to me. It sets up a second game that seemingly will never come and feels contrived in the process. In a more campy game with a more fun tone, this big reveal could be a bit fun here, but it feels manipulative. Unfortunately, the narrative's neatness can end in it feeling a little obvious. Sorry to do this again, but like The Last of Us, the story matters far less than how the characters get there, and Days Gone has plenty of elements to make that journey more engaging. For one, Sarah's headstone is a grounding point throughout much of the game. Deacon regularly visits and recaps some of his stories, crucially giving an insight into his mind. Being somewhat of a stoic to those around him, this allows for his mask to slip and his emotions to come pouring out. I left wanting a little more from these scenes, but I still found myself looking forward to watching them every time. This is what world building feels like when your main character doesn't care for it, and the more organic parts of this exploration make the game so much better. I can't fault someone for missing parts of the narrative told through memos and collectibles because the game feels uncaring about them in the first place. The world doesn't really reward that exploration, so why would you bother? One of the many plot threads you follow is that of the neuroscientists. This serves a similar purpose to Sarah's headstone, adding some scientific credence to why and how the freaks operate. It does a good job humanizing the hordes without ever doing such a good job that you can think for even a second before running the next one down. There's room for a broader discussion about this through the lens of ludonarrative dissonance, but this video is already getting long enough and I don't think it would benefit from yet another tangent. Anyway, here's another tangent. I think people talk about the logic of video games, they don't mean logic in a strict sense, but rather verisimilitude. Not does this make sense, but more so does this suit the world I'm playing. Days Gone regularly runs into both, like Nero are impervious to guns but can be killed with bites, or Deacon has seemingly no filter in stealth mode, shouting at full volume next to people. There are some connected strands around explosives, his wife, and a few other sections that are never quite addressed. While Nero recordings do go some way to address parts of how the infection work, they don't cover everything as I'd like, and it can make the game feel a bit janky. My goal here isn't to compare in a shallow light the size of horses' testicles in the snow, or how water reacts to bullets. I don't want games that are so hyper-detailed that they forget the power of allowing the player to fill in the gaps with their mind. I bring up these points to say there are lines we often draw between the video game we're playing and the work of art in front of us, both being the same thing, of course. Days Gone, with its need to take from AAA projects like the Witcher-like tracking and Ubisoft-styled towers that can ping nearby encampments, it portrays the risks this game could have taken. It's both ambitious and a little mundane. There's an urge to call Days Gone a humans are the real monsters story, but I don't think this is quite fair. Humans are the real monsters isn't just a subtext in this, it is instead a fundamental part of Deacon's ideological framework. Then Days Gone's story about the ways in which humans help each other, even at the detriment of themselves, is antithetical to that. Deacon doesn't just change and grow, he's actively criticised in the text of the narrative. These political affronts aren't just textures, they're excuses for Deacon to disconnect, much like he did pre-Outbreak. Everything is and can be political. As long as groups of people agree on what the world should be and how to get there, we have politics. Then, clashing into this, Deacon is a man who is deeply anti-politics, yet can't help but get involved. He finds a second and third home at these camps, and despite grumbling on his bike, helps them out anyway. He's a curmudgeon, and the game knows this. The game's narrative would feel more insufferable if it felt like Deacon was right for his decisions, but I never felt this. I think he's just empathized with. This does unfortunately lead down a bit of a path where everyone is criticised and the narrative feels unwilling to stake a claim in anything more. I wish it committed a little to the political frameworks you can analyse the camps through by giving solutions to problems, or at least attempts, but it's far too self-centred for that. It's politically uncreative, but not politically dishonest. Deacon's engagement in the narrative is repentance for the person he was, the person he still is, and the person he wants to be. I'm trying to dance around some of the narrative to let you explore parts of it yourself, but there are sections at the end of the game that feel narratively satisfying on paper, but unsatisfying in reality. Engagement in story is a box-ticking exercise. This desire to cleanly fold up and package parts of the narrative feel like it leaves it scrambling to give the player everything. Sometimes that ends up in the game undercutting itself. It's gritty and dark, yet human, and somehow parts of its narrative never manage to tie those three concepts together in a way that feels true to itself. Days Gone slows down to a crawl and hurtles forward into a place of narrative whiplash, never feeling quite confident enough in itself to pull it through the finish line without a reason to sign a petition for a sequel. For this reason, I don't necessarily know if I want to see it. I like the idea of Bend writers being able to flesh out the world they've envisioned more, but don't know if I fully trust them either. That being said, I felt what the narrative was trying to do. When Deacon hunted down a member of a camp who killed another, and he told Deacon through tears that he didn't want to hang, I felt bad. When Deacon mercy killed many, many people, I connected to it, and it stuck with me when I got a shower. When I went to bed, I felt the weight of those narrative strands. Days Gone has this parallel to Red Dead Redemption's Jose Gonzalez scene when you reach Mexico and the music is emotive and it punches through. It signifies the strengths of the narrative this far, and this is a key part of Days Gone's music. With its flutter of strings, big open chords, and anthemic melodic lines, it's a soundtrack that is much about the adventure as it is about solemnness and loneliness. In the right context, it can and does add quite a lot to the game's central narrative moments. It can also seriously pound with industrial screeches and drums. I told myself after getting the platinum for my Anthem retrospective that I wouldn't be making this a recurring thing. It's too time consuming, and it feels unfair to try and evaluate a game if that game is a particularly grueling platinum. I told myself the extra tens of hours weren't worth the effort and I should just finish a game when I finish it. Then I got the platinum for Days Gone. Mapping up hordes of infected and hunting down extra collectibles became both methodical and intriguing at points. It allowed me space to listen to Nero field recordings and peel back more of the game. Though I don't see myself ever picking up the game again, I'm glad I got the platinum. I enjoyed reflecting on the narrative and the ways in which I've misunderstood and judged it. Given Garvin's comments, I wouldn't have expected it to try and engage with some semblance of politics itself. Given the perception, I wouldn't have expected so many positive reviews. I enjoyed the fact that Deacon, a man who once gave bodies to a work camp for extra cash, is directly critical of the inherently coercive nature of letting people starve unless they work harder than the work that is otherwise needed to nourish them. There are, of course, institutional and structural parallels you can draw here, and I might just do that one day. I like that the game is quite cruel, yet diametrically opposed to cruelty itself. This is perhaps what feels most jarring about Garvin's statements about his own game. To a particularly mean-spirited mind, one that consumes much of media and cultural criticism, he could be perceived as woke. Not too dogmatically so, but woke nonetheless. Days Gone's direct criticism of toxic masculinity and its mentions of the whiteness of Oregon are lines I'm surprised didn't get called out by reactionaries yet. Days Gone has become a bit of a catalyst for anti-journalists and anti-woke further. Part of this is because the term is, of course, an amalgam of feelings, a concept loosely defined by what certain people dislike and are afraid of, and a broad diminutive term to imply insincerity. Perhaps the reason this wasn't levied at Days Gone is because of the personalization of Deacon. He's a veteran, he's scarred and hurt, his want for his bike is driven partially by his brutalization from the system, and so too is his indifference. His veritable inhumanity and willingness to let people suffer is human in a really dark way. Days Gone, for its many flaws and insincere moments, doesn't feel wholly inorganic. It's a game that feels very of its time, which is quite weird to say about a game that only launched in the last decade, but it also came out pre-pandemic, and that lends a different edge to the whole thing, and one I don't know if we'll ever see Bend Studio revisit. Days Gone is much like Deacon himself. It's deeply flawed and often driven by ill-thought-out intentions. It takes a little too much inspiration from bad places and ends up a bit rough around the edges, but ultimately it has way more heart than you might give it credit for at first. It builds and has room to grow, even if I'm content to let it stay exactly where it is for now. And that's my video on Days Gone. Thank you so much for listening. This one took ages to make for some reason, and it ended up being one of the biggest scripts I've ever written. I don't know how. I don't know why I had that much to say about Days Gone, and I could probably say so much more. Thank you so much for watching this. If you could subscribe, I'd love that. I'm trying to hit 500, and I'm very, very close now. So the goal was to hit that by the end of the year, but we're almost there already, which I truly can't believe. I feel very, very lucky. If you would like to make me feel even more lucky, then please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.